probably would. Most probably the tension would remain. But in the midst of all this, there is a certain goodwill, a certain kind of optimism, a certain kind of understanding, a certain kind of human empathy. And all that in their embryonic form one can get in this book. So at one level it's a personal account, at another level it is an account of the beginnings of a situation that was going to unfold over the decades and lead to some very, very tragic consequences. Shraddha, you have done a very good job. I congratulate you. No, I'm not flattering you. I get nothing by flattering you. But it is absolutely honest. You have done a good book. And believe me, it's not easy to write a good book. So thank you, congratulations, and all the best.
Sharda, Hiranmay, Dr. Gupta, and dear friends, I recognize many, many friends in the audience here today. A few weeks ago, I received this email from Sharda, whom I'd never met before, but we instantly, I think, related to each other. She spoke to me, and she wrote to me, rather, about the book that you all probably have seen, about her father, and these related to her father's years in Ceylon, as it was called then. And she sent me a PDF of the book via email, and I had the opportunity to go through it. And I instantly recognized so much that was familiar in the account that she had penned. Because I've had a connection with Sri Lanka, having spent 4 years of my diplomatic career there, 2 in the early 80s when I was a junior officer, and 2 when I went there as India's High Commissioner in 2004. And in the intervening period, so much had happened and so much had changed as far as that country was concerned. But why I connected to Sharada's tribute, you may say, to her, to this chronicle of her father's years in Ceylon, was because the issues that she described in this book were issues that I was also familiar with. Because during my first posting in Sri Lanka, from 1981 to 1983, I had the designation First Secretary Agreement. I don't think there are very many First Secretaries around the world who have that appellation or that description of duties. But agreement in this context referred to the Sirimavo Shastri Pact and the Indira Gandhi Sirimavo Agreement, which came a little later. And what did that deal with? It basically dealt with the future, the destiny, the fate of this population of Indian Tamils, or Tamils of Indian origin, who had come to the island as indentured labor in the 19th century and stayed on to make Sri Lanka's, in the early years, coffee and then later the tea industry so successful and such an important contributor to Sri Lanka's prosperity. And these people, and as Hiranmay very rightly pointed out, had been the object of a lot of attention, let me say, in Sri Lankan political circles, who have, I believe, continue to have, this somewhat unarticulated, let me say, subliminal fear of India and being somewhat, swallowed up, let me say, by Indian influence or Indian political gaming when it comes to that country. And it's just a fear that articulates itself in so many, somewhat, I would say, irrational ways on so many frequent occasions. And in the case of these Indian Tamils, as you will see from the book, you will see how the Ceylon legislature, the Ceylon political parties, particularly the Sinhala Sinhalese parties in the 30s and 40s of the 20th century were speaking about these people, that they were taking away from Ceylon rather than giving to Ceylon, and that therefore they had, this large block of people, it wasn't so large really, but that this block of people should somehow not continue to make Ceylon their home, and that India should assume responsibility for them and take them back, basically. Not allow them a permanent home in Ceylon or Sri Lanka. And these were people who had lived on the island for generations and who had really no other home to go to. And why I was able to relate, once again coming back to what I said in the beginning, was that I had seen these people while I was First Secretary in the High Commission. I would continuously travel between Colombo and Kandy, which is really the door to the hill country. They call it the hill country or the up country in Sri Lanka, basically the mountainous central part of the country. Beautiful, extremely idyllic. I've never seen anything as attractive really in all my travels as the up country in Sri Lanka. And these people were basically concentrated there, and they lived there, they worked there, their entire lives were spent in those line houses. The women would work from dawn to dusk. The children had very little education. And to top it all, they were stateless, basically stateless. They were people without a country, essentially, despite the fact that they were essentially born on Sri Lankan soil and had lived there, and that was the only world that they knew of. So that problem that Sharada speaks of in her book, and which her father, Mr. Pai, handled when he was the Raj agent in Ceylon, continued over the independence years into the 80s when I was there. And here we were, the First Secretary Agreement in Colombo and the First Secretary Rehabilitation in Kandy, who happened to be Gopal Krishna Gandhi. We would be constantly, conferencing with each other about, the next batch of people who had to be repatriated, what kind of rehabilitation would be provided for them in Tamil Nadu once they went back. And I knew that this was a story of human misery, basically, because we would go to Talaimannar, we would take the ferry between Talaimannar and Mandapam, and at Mandapam there was this miserable relief camp, rehabilitation camp, where they would land, they would be completely lost, completely disoriented, and then they would be sort of farmed out, parceled out to different rehabilitation centers all across Tamil Nadu, where there was resentment against them too, especially if you went to the Nilgiris, where some of them were accommodated in the plantations there, the tea plantations. There was resentment from the locals that these people had come and usurped some of their livelihoods suddenly out of the blue, and they were seen as Ceylonis, basically as Sri Lankans, and all kinds of tales were told about them, and essentially an opprobrium sort of hung over them. So these were really, a group of people who had been shortchanged on both sides of the Pork Strait, both in Sri Lanka and in India. And when I was reading your book, and I enjoyed it thoroughly, let me say, I read through every page, and what particularly fascinated me was the interview conducted by Sir John Kothrawala with Jawaharlal Nehru, and the kind of prejudice and suspicion that comes through from Kothrawala when he talks about the Indians in Ceylon and the fact that India sends these people there and then complains about their welfare and well-being, which they shouldn't be doing, and the cool and very collected manner in which Mr. Nehru responds to his fulminations, let me say, Kothrawala's fulminations, and basically puts him in his place, saying that what India is ready to do is take back anybody who wants to come. But if some people want to stay there, have their families there, have their livelihoods there, why should they be sent back? I mean, there's no reason why that should be But I'm not sure if the Sri Lankans were convinced about that, because the problem continued. And at the time I was there, the person who was like the most important, let me say, sun in the solar system for us was the Controller General of Immigration of Sri Lanka, who happened to be a gentleman called Mr. Vanigaratne, who would constantly talk about the distinction between Sinhalese and South Indians, as he called them. And he would point to himself, and he looked like the rest of us, basically. And he would say, look at me, look at my Aryan bone structure. and look at the rest. I mean, we can find out. And a friend of mine who's still in the Sri Lankan government, I won't name him, was a junior officer at that time in the immigration department. And he would say they would line up these Indian Tamils, and they had to distinguish between those who were entitled to citizenship and those who had to be repatriated to India. And he said the only way we would find out is we would ask them to roll up their sleeves. And if they had the smallpox inoculation on the right side, on the right arm, we knew instantly they were from India. And if they had the inoculation on the left arm, we knew they had been born in Ceylon and they had been, inoculated as babies on the left arm. I happen to have my inoculation on the right, so I would probably fail a citizenship test in Sri Lanka. But at least that was the line that he took. But I'm just mentioning that to illustrate the kind of prejudices that operated as far as these poor people were concerned. And I got to know a lot of, spokespersons for the plantation Tamils while I was there. Very impressive people. I used to go to places like Hatton, Nuwara, Muskelia. These are all places in the upcountry where they had these beautiful estates. And they had a few spokespersons, a few lawyers, a few educated people among the plantation Tamils who would speak out on behalf. All of you have heard of Mr. Tondaman, probably, of the Ceylon Workers' Congress. Actually, he was a descendant of what you would call a Kangani in Tamil. Kangani is a kind of a person who recruits labor and takes them across. So he's a kind of a big boss as far as the labor is concerned. So Tondaman came from that line, very privileged line. But there were others who had grown up in the line houses and who had managed to scrape together an education for themselves and then succeeded in the world outside. And one of them I remember was Mr. C.V. Velupillai. This was before the name Velupillai got associated only with Prabhakaran. I'm talking of an age before that. This is C.V. Velupillai, and he was essentially the bard of the plantations. He was a poet, and he had been educated in English, and I'd like to read from some of his poetry just to give you an idea of the kind of situations these people faced and where they came from. He speaks about their migration from India, and this is how he speaks about it. The weeders and coochmen, coochmen is a slang, I think, for those who recruit these people, reflect and recall their days now and then, how their sires came from across the seas, the Musalman's boat song, the wind upon the mast, the fast swelling sails waft here across the coast, a mother's sigh for a son, a sister's tear for a brother, who sold their souls for gold beneath the tea. They blamed the boatman, the wind upon the sails, the first immigrant who came, footsore on weary trek, and through Anuradhapura fell, languid, broken, dead, because all that was jungle today, where you have roads from Talemanar through Anuradhapura.